Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies. Great to have you joining us here. My name is Michael Liebreich. I'm the founder and chairman of the advisory board of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Now, we have got a fabulous triplet of sessions. It's one session but divided into three, and we'll be looking at the issues of finance and the role of finance in funding the shift to clean energy internationally. I'll introduce my panelists in each of the triplet of sessions separately. So we will be going through, first of all, talking about India. The second session will look at Africa. And the third session will look at the Middle East. But I suspect, from having spoken already to my panelists in the green room, that we'll be roaming fairly broadly. We just had a very interesting conversation that included Poland. We've talked about Indonesia in the green room. So I think we've got an extraordinary few sessions coming up. So what I will do then is I'll introduce our first two panelists. Amos Hochstein, Special Envoy, Coordinator for International Energy Affairs, United States Department of State, and one of our hosts here today in some way, no doubt will be explained. And Minister Piyush Goyal, who's the Minister of State with independent charge for power, coal, new and renewable energy for the government of India. If I might, I'll start with you, Amos. And there's been, over the last few years, I've seen actually over a longer time, over more than a decade, the way in which the US has seen these issues of energy moving into the mainstream of your diplomatic activity, your international relations, not just in the narrow confines of the climate negotiations, but across a much, much broader front. Most recently, then, the US-India dialogue. Could you tell us how that arose, what's been happening, characterize that for us to kick us off here today?
Sure. Well, as I think everybody appreciates, energy has been a part of foreign policy and national security around the world for a very long time. I think probably since the time that oil started trading as a commodity. And we've always had somewhat of an operation in the State Department in the foreign policy arena in the United States that handled that issue, but in a relatively small way, small staffing. At the beginning of the Obama administration, there was a discussion about the need to enhance that. And because it needed to match the events on the ground. I would never argue that government is ahead of the curve on bureaucracy. So we were a little bit behind, but we've played some catch up over the last few years. The feeling was that energy is playing an even greater role in national security, not necessarily by our choice, but by the fact that the actors around the world and the locations where energy is was forcing that issue, and it became part of that conversation. And it was true across the whole spectrum. So whether it was oil and gas, which I think is relatively obvious, where the politics were around that, and the fact that countries were starting to use energy as a weapon and as a tool of foreign policy in a more overt way. And second, into the renewable energy and the kind of energy landscape that we would like to see and encourage. And for that, there is the technical side of it, but there's also the diplomatic side, as we're seeing now unfold, where Secretary Kerry leading the way in some of the negotiations over climate. It's as a foreign policy issue as well as a technical issue. So for all those reasons, we've created a division, a bureau here at the State Department, the bureau that I'm in charge of, to look at that full spectrum of issues in energy. I think as far as you mentioned India and the energy dialogue, again, that's a whole of government approach for the United States, from the Department of Energy and the Department of State and Department of Treasury and USAID, and of course led by the White House interest. But I would say that while we've had an energy discussion with the government of India for several years, since the last elections and the new government has come into power in India, we've definitely accelerated and intensified those discussions. We've made them more specific, more goal-oriented, and we've had a much more intensive discussion on some of the areas where we can work together on.
Could you give an idea of the scope of those discussions? You talked about the areas, you've talked about the agencies, but give us an idea of the sort of the range of discussions, either by technology sector or by topic, that those discussions, what falls into the, What's the boundary of the US-India dialogue?
It's boundless. It's whatever.
Everything is energy, but help us here.
Right. Well, I think if you divide it up into finance, infrastructure, and the third bucket would be effectiveness and efficiency, let's say. I think that those would be three buckets that we would see most of our interaction with the government of India would fit into those three lines. And they're interdependent. In other words, as you can look at, as we want to enhance renewable energy, you can look at the finance piece, which is critically important and more of a barrier than it is an enhancement at the moment, and thinking of ways to get around that. If you look at the infrastructure side, people in the press and conferences like to talk about renewable energy, but the hard facts are that you can't simply just look at how to bring on more renewable energy without also worrying about the grid and the infrastructure and the distribution side. Because, in the previous government, when there was a massive blackout, it wasn't for a lack of generation capacity, it was because of the infrastructure. So you have to look at the infrastructure, and then India is unique. It has there are as many people off-grid in India than there are people in the United States altogether. So you have to look at really creative solutions to look at how do you use new technology, not to repeat and try to go into using old paradigms, but addressing those. So I would say that our engagement really is across those three areas. I think we're still trying to make specific goals that we can achieve together. I think remarkably, India and the United States have some similarities in our operations, as different as we are. We both have a federal and state system that have to deal with each other. So we have to look at all those different things, and we're organized in trying to bring and harness the expertise across the U.S. government to be able to support and to enhance the dialogue.
And is there a specific technology transfer piece to this, or does that fall within, you just mentioned sort of the infrastructure, is that how you see it as kind of being part of that, or is that
Well, I think when you look at the travels of senior government officials from India, they don't only come to Washington these days, they go to Northern California and talk to some. I think what we bring to the table, obviously in the United States, is what is happening at the labs and some of the research and development that's happening through the U.S. government, but most importantly from the private sector and leveraging the U.S. private sector innovation to support what is uniquely Indian issues and concerns, and how to manage that.
Well, the reason I ask is I know that technology transfer is a big goal, a strategic goal of your government, Minister Goyal. But could you give us a sense of the scale of the challenge and the nature of the challenge in energy in India? So separate from the dialogue, but just what are we looking at here? What has to be achieved? You've got very ambitious plans.
Well, India over the years has not been able to provide energy access to nearly 250 million people, even as we speak. And we feel that it's now time that these 250 million people get affordable access to energy, and not in a very long time frame, not even what we are planning in the sustainable energy goal. We are looking at making that happen in the next 4 years. And we are very keen that every Indian should have the ability to access power at affordable prices and quality power. So that, to my mind, is the overarching goal around which we are working the entire energy piece. In that, of course, there are challenges about the grid, ensuring, as you rightly said, adequate transmission across the country. It's very important to have redundancy and adequate capacity to withstand any significant instabilities in the grid which caused the August 2012 disaster. At the same time, we have nearly 50 million people who live in very far-flung areas and may not be able to be connected to the grid very easily. They're in the remote mountains, in the forests, far away from the grid, where the cost-benefit analysis and the time taken for the grid to reach them may be much longer. So we're looking at off-grid solutions to reach energy to these 50 million people in far-flung areas. Along with all of this, we are very conscious of energy security. And for us, renewable energy has a mix of both clean environment and energy security. And in fact, I was reading that Thomas Edison had mentioned many, many years ago that he hoped that people would recognize the value of the sun and of wind before they are forced to do it. And I'm glad that the world today recognizes that wind energy and solar energy are very good substitutes, very robust substitutes. In the long run, they'll pay well for the system since costs tend to flatten out as against fossil fuels where there's always an uncertainty going into the future. So we are very, very committed to our programs for ensuring energy access, and within that access, as the demand grows more towards not only meeting people's own domestic needs, but larger industrialization and job creation. We are very keen that we also have a greater focus on renewable energy.
So within that, there's a lot of work to be done. It could be characterized as infrastructure or really around the regulation of your utilities, because the key word for investment in clean energy or any sort of energy is bankability and credit. And that's really been a huge issue in India, holding back the sector really for decades. What are you doing to sort of sort out that some of the basic work that almost needs to be done at your end? Could you just talk about that?
You're absolutely right. That's one of the legacies that I inherited when our government came into power in May of last year. And the stress that the utilities are facing, it's as we speak about $10 billion lost every year for the inefficiencies in the power distribution sector. We are seized of the matter. We have worked out a very holistic, all-encompassing program that will not only bring down this $10 billion annual loss to zero in the next 3.5 years, but will also ensure that in the long run, these distribution companies are not allowed to be profligate in their finances. There are very good hard budget constraints being brought in a new program that we are on the verge of finalizing in the next couple of weeks. And we are very confident that the DISCOM stress that has held back investments in the energy sector will be a thing of the past. But having said that, in the interregnum, what I'm doing is that to mitigate the counterparty risks and ensure that investors feel more secure when they come to India, we've introduced our power utilities, which are AAA rated companies like the National Thermal Power Company, which produces nearly 25% of India's total energy. And it's a AAA $25 billion government of India entity. And 2 or 3 other such government-sponsored entities, which are actually writing out the PPA to ensure that investors have a safety over the length of the PPA, 20, 25 years, and feel the investment gets more security. Coupled with that, obviously, I recognize that the infrastructure and the grid transmission capacity has to be increased to absorb the 175 gigs of renewable energy that we are planning to put out there by 2022. We've already initiated about $6 billion programs for greening the grid, adding capacity to evacuate solar and wind energy. And in the next 7 years, my estimate is that we'll be investing nearly $50 billion, largely through private investment, into the expansion of the grid to absorb this large amount of renewable. Because in renewable, more than the cost of power, at times it's the cost of transmission that stresses the benefit.
That's right. In some cases, we've seen dollar for dollar. $1 goes into the renewables and $1 goes into the grid. Just in terms of the losses, I mean, there are clearly losses because of technical sort of
Yes.
ancient infrastructure, losses where people are taking the electricity without paying. But there's also one of the reasons behind the 10 billion loss is it not because of not subsidies but caps that are imposed on electricity prices, and will you be removing those as a way of stimulating investment?
No, incidentally, there are no caps on electricity prices in India. We have a very robust regulatory mechanism which determines the prices, and the governments do not interfere in price setting, except that we recognize that there is a large section of society which cannot afford expensive power. So we have a robust mechanism provided for by legislation, which allows a cross-subsidy where the poorer and the less privileged sections are given power at a cheaper price. Some of it is cross-subsidized with large domestic and industrial consumers, and some of it is paid by the state from out of its treasury.
Okay, so that sounds
Having said that,
Yep.
one must also appreciate that the inefficiency of the DISCOM cannot be passed on to the consumer. So if you produce the microphone and you produce it inefficiently, you use more labor, you skim money out of the company, don't have a good technology to back you up, and then you go to the consumer and say that, look, my microphone is $20 more than the competition. He's not going to pay you that $20. So I think our systems are robust. These losses have come because over a period of time, very often states did not provide the subsidy in time. Sometimes the aggregate technical losses have been too high through the transmission and distribution network. We are now trying to plug all of that and have set a national target to bring down the losses from 27% to 15% in the next 3 years.
Okay, so, and we spoke earlier about a piece of work that we did called Climate Scope, where we look state by state and see the extent to which the states are actually attractive locations for investment, and that's something
I'm looking forward to
I'll
that.
very much look forward to your feedback and see whether we've got that right or not. But it does sound like you have very specific plans to solve in a sense, the local issues, and you also started to talk about the amount of money that you need, the scale of the financing challenge. Put some numbers on it if you can.
I'll be delighted to. My program in the next 5 years envisages an investment of $250 billion. Out of that $250 billion, about $100 billion will be getting into the renewable energy program, which will add about 145 gigs into the system. Apart from that, I plan to spend about $50 billion, largely in transmission, both for the green energy and for our regular upgrading the transmission network. The plan in 5 years being that India will be a completely seamless grid, which will be interconnected. I can move power any part of the country at any point of time. We have about a $22 billion investment already underway in the sub-transmission and distribution sector to upgrade the last mile connectivity and bring down the losses. We have one major initiative on energy efficiency, where we are looking at an investment of about $5 billion. Apart from that, we are in the next few years also going to be investing heavily in coal mining. Pardon me for
You don't have to look at me.
announcing it here. But, and also certain amount of additional capacity generation in the large hydro and coal-based plants. So all of this put together will be about a $250 billion committed plan in the next 5 years.
So, Almost. Obviously, you're not going to buy the coal bit, but how much of the other pieces? I mean, that's a very substantial shopping list. Which parts are you helping with, and how are you helping? What are the mechanisms that you're deploying? We heard about some of them at lunch, but which ones specifically in the case of India look like they're working?
Well, first I would say we support the goals and the ambitious goals that India is setting it, that the minister has articulated. We have no problems with any of the goals. I think spending $250 billion on this, getting to 175 gigawatts of renewable energy, this is all admirable, and we hope that we get there. I think that you have to, where I have some concerns is where we are working together to figure this out is on the details. When you push a lot from the federal to the state, not all states were born equal as far as their attractiveness for business. But not only, I haven't seen the scope yet, but they're not all creditworthy. So it makes a difference for companies that want to make the investments, a prioritization between states that are creditworthy versus states that are not. The finance piece is complicated, and I think how the money is spent from the central government in order to spur the investment is critical, because there's not enough money, there's not enough government money, not here, not in Europe, not in Asia, not in India, to pay for this to all happen, to achieve all these goals. This can't come out of balance sheet. This can't come from cash. So therefore, it's about a certain equilibrium that there's this tipping point that we have to reach. And in every market, it's going to be different. And the tipping point is, what is the role of government? And by public sector, I would say local government, international financial institutions, and others that are willing to come in and support. And what kind of financing mechanisms do they have to provide in order to make it good enough and sustainable enough for the private sector to come in with the much larger amounts of money that will make the actual investment? And I think that's where, over the last year, despite an enormous amount of work by the minister, who seems to be everywhere at all times, and is, has been putting his heart and soul into this, we still are not there yet as far as identifying and giving the comfort level for companies to come off the sidelines with the money that's available and interested to come in. Because what we know from every conference, and we have a lot of them, on renewable energy, is that India is the panacea. That's where everybody wants to go. But they all have these caveats of what it would take for them to come in. So I think what we've been trying to do is talk together on some things that we can work on, some ideas, because leveraging the ideas across the U.S. government, the private sector, understanding what it would take, and discussing how we can help in getting to the goal.
May I just add? I think till about a few months ago, the story was a little disconcerting and a little worrisome. But in the last few weeks, we've had some significant amount of bids out in the market to source solar energy. And all of them are now designed in a very transparent manner, equal opportunity for everybody to bid in the system. And you'll be delighted that we've been able to bring down solar energy prices by about 20 to 22%, only by bringing in a greater degree of competition and transparency in the procurement process. As regards the few states where the challenges of credibility are there, that's where we are looking at NTPC or Solar Energy Corporation or Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency, all of them putting in their might behind those contracts to ensure that they become the intermediary, and they guarantee that even if the state defaults, they will ensure both purchase of power and the payment, timely payment, for which we are creating back-end support from within the federal government.
But this is exactly the example of why we're having this dialogue and why I think it's so important. Because if you go back to the discussions at the RE Invest conference that the minister headlined and organized in India last year, I think it was February, some of the ideas that came out of this kind of a dialogue that we're doing, because the dialogue is not just government to government, the idea is to bring in the private sector, and the minister and I sat there for about an hour and a half listening to a roundtable of complaints, comments about what they needed to come in, and that's what we've been using the dollars to identify. Okay, beyond all the verbiage that we're hearing and the talking points, what do you need? What does the government of India need to address? What do we need to look at? And securitization was one of the things that we talked about quite often in that dialogue, and what the minister just addressed in how starting to come up with these solutions that he talked about for the states that don't have the credit worthy, it's born out of there. So the dialogue has to remain dynamic so that what we talked about last year is not going to be what we talk about next year.
So we've seen some very big announcements of private players investing, or maybe not investing, but announcing intentions to invest, and there is sometimes a difference. I'm thinking of people like, I think it's SoftBank, NTT most recently. I'm trying to think if there have been equivalent announcements of US companies coming in. So this is a slightly loaded question. So I think the answer is that I'm sure there are some that are just about to be announced, probably tomorrow. But is that the sort of thing that you're working on? I mean, perhaps it's a question for either of you. How did you bring in those? There's a few Japanese companies. Is that part of the dialogue? Are American companies more risk averse? Why aren't we seeing those big announcements from American companies?
Is it your question or?
It's whoever wants to take the difficult question.
He asked me the same question. question recently about, so it's,
No, I didn't even I just prompted you. I didn't
Minister,
prompt you.
let's start with, are there any specific things you did to attract those investment statements? And then, Amos, I'll hand it to you. You can prepare your thoughts.
I think Masa-san of SoftBank has been quite legendary in terms of his ability to move quickly where there's an opportunity. And clearly, India today is the world's largest market and a far more stable economy than any other comparable sized economy today in the world. It's also an aspirational billion looking for a better quality of life. So I think Masa-san was quick off the feet, put in his best team in India, partnered with some very good companies, got Nikesh Arora, his successor, to spend a lot of time in India and interact with everybody. And I think he's going to significantly benefit from the first mover advantage. In fact, I've been urging American companies not to lose this opportunity because I'm already finding the Chinese are coming in a big way. I had a delegation only 4 days back committing $5 billion. Masa-san has committed $20 billion. Foxconn is coming in to start manufacturing in India. They recognize that end of the day, given the logistics cost of these large equipments, local manufacture is going to be the only way forward. So I personally feel a year and a half from now, domestic manufacturing will be cheaper than importing these products. So I see the sense of urgency in these countries to cash in on this opportunity. Somehow I have not yet found the American business community looking at India with that aggression. Though, by the way, I must mention, we are looking at promoting a sovereign type fund in India focused on renewable energy under the National Infrastructure Fund that the government of India has decided to set up. One of the sub-funds of the Alternate Investment Trust there is going to focus on renewable energy. The government of India, through its public sector entities, is going to commit capital into that company. And we are now going to finalize very shortly an international sponsor who will then hopefully be able to bring together a pool of capital, long tenor capital.
So I was going to, I have to keep an eye on the clock. I was going to ask you to finish with your call to arms to American companies or investors, and you've just done that. You've said that either companies or investors should beat a path to your door. So I'm going to, Amos, I'll come back to you to answer that question in the sense of, how is that going? But also to sum up this section of our panel.
Well, first, as the U.S., we have a different relationship than most countries do with the energy companies. I don't instruct and we don't make investment recommendations where we have to carry the responsibility. We have a whole legal department that would kill me if I did that for liabilities. But what we're trying to do, this is not about, we're not engaged in the energy dialogue with India or with any other country as a commercial venture to create a market for American companies. We want to support American companies, and any American company that wants to do business in India will support it. But there's two different avenues here. I think that as you see some of the things that the minister is talking about happen and take hold, and that is the securitization, the idea of how a better understanding for companies how they make their money back in cases of default. And I think you'll see if there's investment in the infrastructure side, and they're convinced of that, the investment will follow. And if you look at any other market, that's traditionally been how American companies have progressed. And we've heard the same thing from the American financial institutions and banks. They all were represented very well at the RE Invest conference, right? So the banks were all there. They're trying to understand, is this a place where when the renewable companies, American companies, come to us for financing, are we comfortable yet? They may be slightly more conservative than other countries, but I think it's getting there. Look at the United States. We've had $39 billion of investments in renewable energy in the United States last year. We're already 3/4 of the way in. We're at $35 billion. And with the reduction in cost that the minister talked about, the yield dollar per gigawatt, right, or gigawatt per dollar, is going up. So there is intention by American companies to continue to invest and spend money. I think everybody realizes a market the size of India, with the ambitious goals that this government has, is clearly an advantage and a place that they want to invest. We just have to get, I think, a few more of those details in place, and by the time we have this conversation next year, I think we'll have a different story.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I think what we've heard is a great sense of optimism, two open doors. I think we should thank our first two panelists who've helped us understand what's going on in India, a very dynamic situation and quite a positive one. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going to the right.